The election of the last Fine Gael Labour government in 2011 brought with it a decisive shift in budgetary policy. A progressive approach was replaced with one weighted to favour the very wealthiest. 5 out of 5 of the last budgets were regressive. Each year we heard speech after speech from ministers talking about fairness, but the reality was always one of budgets which made Ireland a more divided and unfair country. In February we had an election campaign in which a self-satisfied government called on the people to keep it going. The core of this was a promise of US levels of taxation and the single largest tax cut ever promised in an Irish election. The Irish people heard this, and in overwhelming numbers they rejected it. No one can doubt that the people voted for a significant change in policy. The core of this is defined by a demand for greater fairness and urgency in addressing a mounting series of crises which the last government allowed to develop. This budget marks one important move forward. The regressive and right-wing ideology of Fine Gael has been curbed. That party's plans for massive tax cuts weighted to the wealthiest have been stopped, and Ireland is not heading down the road to US levels of taxation and public services. This budget is more progressive than any of the 5 which preceded it, and it begins to undo some of the worst damage done by the last government. However, it consists of a series of individual measures which rarely fit within any coherent strategy. In most areas, the impact of specific proposals will be reduced because the government has no idea of what it is trying to achieve. And of course, the policy of overspinning and under-delivering continues unchanged. This has nothing to do with the government's minority status, but everything to do with its drift and lack of either urgency or ambition. This budget is not a major move forward, but it is an important change of direction. It is, to quote Minister Varadkar yesterday, and I quote, "the first fair and socially just budget in a very long time," unquote. It is a stark but honest admission that he and his colleagues used their dominant majority to introduce unfair and socially unjust budgets. The one and only reason for this change of direction is the confidence and supply arrangement with Fianna Fáil. This is not our budget, and it certainly does not fully reflect the policies on which we fought the election or included in our proposed alternative programme for government. But it is a budget we have influenced in important ways. Unlike others, we have not taken a destructive all-or-nothing approach to working for the people we represent. We believe that every member of this House has an obligation to be constructive. Such arrangements are common in Europe, but have not been seen here before this year. Fianna Fáil won a major mandate from the people in February based on a very clear set of promises. Alone of the TDs elected to this Dáil, Fianna Fáil deputies voted 3 times to remove the last government and put in place the only possible alternative government. All of the speeches we are hearing from other parts of the opposition, and particularly the different shades of left, must be filtered through the fact that they did nothing to remove Fine Gael from government. So please give us a break from your self-righteous posturing about us allowing the budget to be passed. It is nothing but empty and cynical politics, which is simply reinforcing the fact that you have no interest in using your mandates constructively. It's hard to listen to accusations from Mary Lou MacDonald about Fianna Fáil protecting its hide, given our own party's history. As far as we can see, and obviously subject to implementation, this budget meets the basic commitments contained within the Confidence and Supply Agreement. There are items which we believe should have been addressed in this year's budget, and the handling of the process has been unacceptable. But the core redirection away from Fine Gael's ideology has been achieved. Therefore, we will, of course, honour our agreement concerning the budget. However, let no one be in any doubt the lack of strategic purpose, the non-transparent figures and shambolic process is not sustainable. The basic economic background to this budget is positive in comparison to many countries, but contains very important causes for concern. Strategic investments of the past in relation to education, skills, research, infrastructure and a pro-enterprise tax regime remain the primary drivers of economic growth. Completely absent from the speeches and documents issued yesterday was any engagement with the fact that we cannot stand still. We cannot take growth for granted. Just as the global economy is rapidly changing and throwing up new threats and opportunities, Ireland has to keep innovating if it is to achieve and sustain high living standards. This is a government which has a fiscal policy and a political objective, but no general economic policy. It has no proposals concerning any new strategic direction or objectives for the economy. The basic plans produced in the decade and a half before the last government took office remain in place, often repackaged within the covers of shiny new documents, but with no substantive change. This is what is at the heart of the drift we see. For example, the two-tiered nature of the recovery, the split between high skills employment and increasingly insecure employment, is the direct result of failing to engage with new problems. The weak and directionless response to the Brexit vote is deeply serious. This budget should have included a number of specific scenarios for the impact of Brexit, but instead is full of repetition of small measures which are just tokenism. Brexit demands and requires further action, and the list we got yesterday was a very disingenuous list. It related to issues that had already been in previous budgets, expansion of some, but was in no shape or form a coherent response to the Brexit situation. And the base scenario in this budget assumes an exchange rate for next year of 85 pence to a euro. Yesterday, the exchange rate was 91 pence to a euro. So given the behaviour of the May government, assuming that sterling will strengthen by over 6% is worse than foolish. And I think the government needs to address this core issue, because it's the devaluation of sterling that represents the most immediate and very serious threat to Irish-owned businesses who export to the British market, and has also very serious implications for the border counties and the north-south trade. And the impact is already being felt. And we've seen the fallout in the horticulture industry, for example, and no evidence of anything in yesterday's budget that seriously address those core issues. The negative impact of Brexit, as I said, is not hypothetical. It's already hitting our exporters. And the slow and partial response of the government is a direct threat to economic growth. IBEC is calling for a currency crisis package, and this should be considered, and I would have thought should have formed part of yesterday's budget. In infrastructure, in research, transport, industrial priorities and many other critical areas, there is no substance in this budget or in the government's ongoing work. And this has nothing to do with the government's lack of majority. I know there are those who wake up in the morning and have a fit of the vapours at the thought of weak government. They should remember that we have just had 5 years of a government which had the largest majority in our history, yet it failed to do any serious strategic planning and allowed problem after problem to escalate to crisis level, particularly in housing, homelessness and in health. Ministers have major policy resources available to them. Only they are in the position to develop detailed plans for their areas. Their failure to do so is because of their lack of interest or commitment, not their lack of a majority in Dáil Éireann. There is a need for more cohesion and better strategic planning. I mean, Taoiseach, many people are wondering around this House what Minister Shane Ross is doing in his particular portfolio. There's been absolute sort of silence for the last number of months, and we're all wondering what is going to emerge from that department in due course. You may take that in hand, Taoiseach. There was a time, Taoiseach, when you were very enthusiastic about report cards. I respectfully suggest that the report cards of some of your ministers would not be glowing at this particular juncture. There's no room for taking fiscal risks at this time. The international situation is far too uncertain. We have to be in a position to respond to any number of possible economic crises. The longer-term debt target announced yesterday is essentially irrelevant, as it's too far out to be meaningful. What does matter is the immediate future, and here a prudent approach is absolutely essential. It's a pity that the government has gone from being sceptical about the huge GDP revision for last year to actually now embracing it as a vindication of its policies. The underlying position is nowhere near as positive, and more restraint and less spin is in order. And I think it reveals a lack of strategic direction. that no effort has been made or was made in advance of those CSO figures being published, about 26% growth, that we didn't have a more realistic model ourselves as a country and you as a government to give the true underlying position in relation to our economy. The overall fiscal stance must help underpin domestic confidence and help address critical issues which are undoubtedly a drag. The proposed outturn is mildly expansionary and is sustainable. The Rainy Day Fund, which we have promoted, which Michael McGrath has been consistent on over the last 2 to 3 years, and which the government now proposes to adopt in the next year or two, I think is prudent and should ensure in time, once implemented, that Ireland has one of the better outcomes of countries in the context of our fiscal treaty obligations. Although I think, Taoiseach, the reservations from the Fiscal Advisory Council should be given more serious weight by the government. It's our sense that the government has been too dismissive of the Fiscal Council in recent years, and that seems to be a continuing trait from the ministers responsible in terms of finance and public expenditure. It should be noted also, Taoiseach, that in the pre-budget proposals produced by groups and parties, there was no economically credible alternative to the proposed fiscal aggregates. The £25 billion package announced by the AAA and the PPB, People Before Profit and Anti-Austerity Alliance, is welcome because for the first time it lays out in detail the incredible anti-worker policies of our hard left. Because massive new taxes on the private sector and other targeted hits designed to drive up private rents show a consistent ideology. While the Socialist Party and Socialist Workers' Party, which form the core of the two alliances, have still not been able to agree on everything, they have finally shown to every private sector worker what they stand for. It would result in the loss of thousands of jobs if your policies were implemented. 50,000 jobs in everywhere except in the private sector. You don't believe the private sector should increase any jobs? Well, I am in a circuitous route, but I acknowledge. And while Sinn Féin is obviously uncomfortable, very uncomfortable with the full scale of the policies it advocated in the Right to Change manifesto this year, remember that, through the Chair? I think everybody should read the Right to Change manifesto, which Sinn Féin have signed up for, because it's alternative. And apart from that, the Sinn Féin alternative budget includes nearly €2 billion in new taxes. The claim that this would have no negative economic impact shows that the party remains obsessed with its left flank rather than offering a credible alternative. I would like to congratulate Deputy Howland for his article on Monday, condemning the budget as, quote, not fair, progressive or sensible, unquote. Given that even his one-time colleague, Minister Varadkar, has said the last 5 budgets, quote, were not fair and socially just, Labour is clearly still living in denial. Before dealing with the detailed areas covered by the budget, it's important to address the budgetary process. It is a shambles. It directly works against soundly based policy and credible political debate. This must be the last budget produced in this manner. If we assume, and I accept that the assumption could be naive, that the government was not deliberately misleading people, both in public and in private, the appearance of 300 million extra in the last week suggests at best a lack of control. And that was not acceptable practice, Taoiseach, I would put it to you, that so much additional millions became available at the 11th hour and was communicated to other parties literally at the 11th hour, just a few days in advance. There has been no serious review of what this budget will deliver or the figures behind it. Ongoing activity is sold in the same way as new initiatives, and the debate is reactive rather than strategic. The spring statement and announced spending envelopes are meaningless and never reflect the final outcomes. The idea of an annual budget day should be ended. Let us have detailed scrutiny of no policy change estimates and policy initiatives in advance. A single high-stakes political showpiece makes no sense and does not deliver good policy. Most countries have a lengthier and iterative process, which makes greater demands on government and on opposition alike. We will be insisting on the early establishment of the independent Oireachtas Budget Office and seeking early discussions on a deeper reform of the budgetary process. And that will impact on opposition as well as on government and will carry with it responsibilities for opposition parties as well in proposing ideas on proposals. But the Budget Oversight Committee, as we've witnessed it so far, was not in position, I would argue, early enough to have a meaningful impact on this budget. But people need to turn up and face up to the challenge. If we develop proper budgetary scrutiny within Parliament, that people assume their responsibilities properly in that regard. As I've said before, the fact that the fiscal space is limited still allows for choices. The forced rebalancing of the budget towards essential services and supports has allowed for some improvements. Public services had been cut to the bone over the past 5 years and had to be given priority. Fianna Fáil insisted on services being given a priority over tax cuts, as it is the right thing to do. The increases in pensions and other payments are a direct result of the rebalancing and specific provisions of the Supply and Confidence Agreement. To brief otherwise is fooling no one. In relation to pensions, Fianna Fáil makes no apology for the priority we have given to the elderly. In recent years, cuts in a range of vital supports for the elderly. You know them, Taoiseach, the phone allowance, the abolition of that, the medical card prescription charge up to $2.50 from 50 cents, had a particularly disproportionate impact on elderly people on lots of medication. And other cutbacks in fuel allowance, the property tax on people surviving on the pension on its own. All of that cumulatively had a very negative impact on the net take income of pensioners, as well as the huge health expenditures that they have to incur. And so the pension increase that results from this budget, and which we were very clear on, plus the changes on prescription thresholds, will help. Although I think the $2.50 is too high still. I remember James Riley came in proposing 5 years ago to abolish a 50-cent prescription charge. And then he proceeded to go ahead and increase it to $2.50. And that's had a significant impact on a lot of people on a lot of medication. And as GPs and pharmacists will tell you, that's particularly the situation with pensioners and people as they age in life. They will be dependent on that. As for the increases in other payments, these are possible only because of the rebalancing forced on Fine Gael due to the Confidence and Supply Agreement. It's amusing to see those who took an unreconstructed right-wing approach in the election and in the negotiations afterwards trying to soften their image through partisan briefings. We support the increase in all payments, and as we said repeatedly in discussions with ministers, their decision to delay starting dates is bad policy. We regret that the government has chosen to delay implementation of certain commitments in relation to education. The emptiness of the so-called Action Plan on Education can be seen in the fact that the budget does not fund any initiative contained within it. It's not a strong budget on education, this particular budget. The Confidence and Supply Agreement requires a reduction in class sizes, and we will be insisting that this be addressed. The ending of all ring-fence provision for guidance and counselling was an incredibly damaging and regressive decision. The impact of this on disadvantaged communities in particular has been terrible, and we expect the reversal of this to be fully implemented next year. Now, there's a start being made in this budget. It has to be ex-quota, Taoiseach. It's an ex-quota provision is what is in the Confidence and Supply. There's resistance to that within the Department of Education. There's resistance among some groups in education. Some people want to have the full deployment for themselves. But if we're serious about mental health for young people, proper professional ex-quota guidance, counselling provision should be restored and made available to the young students in our second-level schools across the country, where they can get good, solid counselling and advice, free of stigma, and that could nip many issues in the bud if properly provided. Its removal was a shocking decision. It was cynical. It was done to camouflage a reduction in the second-level PTR, to please the unions and so on like that, and avoid any political outcry at the time. And so the guidance councils were sacrificed as a result of that. And I think that, and we're keen, and we're saying very clearly that we expect the reversal of this to be fully implemented next year. The ending of postgraduate grants was a targeted attack on the ability of many to gain critical qualifications. The restarting of these grants, which we have fought for, begins the unwinding of a callous and unnecessary cut. It also was strategically stupid to cut postgraduate grants and to eliminate them. If we're serious about the country and investment into the future, fourth-level education is essential. And what's worrying is that so many young people now, from average income families, have decided not to pursue master's degrees or PhDs because of the chronic underfunding of the sector and the inability to afford it. So that's something that is urgent. We've also identified a crisis in third-level funding as approaching emergency levels, and the 31 million yesterday, while it may stabilise the situation, is nowhere near enough. And what is now needed is a strategy for investment in a sector whose success is central to our economic and social future. And if one has to just pick one area where the absence of a strategic direction was so evident in yesterday's budget, it's the absence of a proper, realistic response to the Cassell's report. That was a comprehensive report put together at the last government's instigation to look at third-level education. All of the options involve increases in state subvention. They're looking for a response in the order of 120 million per annum. The 30 million yesterday will go nowhere near that. Nothing has been done so far in relation to the National Training Fund and making some provision that elements of that fund or a portion of that fund could be allocated to third-level education. The issue has simply been kicked down the road into the Oireachtas Committee. And that's a bit of a cop-out to say we have to go into all the options, and particularly option 4 to do with student loans. We can go into that detail on student loans, but that is somewhere down the road. But there's no reason why government can't respond, and should have responded yesterday and in the next budget, in terms of increasing significantly the amount of money going to third level. If you look at the graphs, Taoiseach, they're extremely worrying in terms of the downward spiral over the last number of years, both in terms of our universities in world rankings and in terms of some Institute of Technologies being almost in an insolvent position. The student teacher or lecturer ratios are at an appalling level in some instances across this sector now. And it's something that requires a dramatic and properly realistic response from government. And I think it goes to the heart of the lack of strategic direction, because this is key to growth and economic development into the future, to the skills issue, to attracting foreign direct investment, and indeed facilitating our own Irish-owned companies to grow and develop with the right qualified personnel behind them. The small provisions concerning research, Taoiseach, contained in the Department of Jobs, Enterprise and Innovation implement already announced policy, and they will not stop the loss of important scientific policy and double down on an approach which is narrowing our research base, which will continue to damage our long-term prospects. This government's approach to science has been roundly condemned by a range of independent voices, and nothing is to change. And this has been going on for years, Taoiseach. The loss of hundreds of researchers and the exclusion of most basic research from funding is causing real damage and is set to continue. And I refer to an editorial last week in the Financial Times, Taoiseach, in terms of the Nobel laureate for science and research, and the fundamental point made that if you do not invest in basic research, in pure research, blue sky thinking, then you undermine the capacity of a society over a longer-term process to respond to the big issues of the day and to create new products, new solutions and new thinking around which the future economic growth and development will depend. And your policy, and the policy pursued by Minister Bruton in particular whilst in enterprise, and possibly continued on while in education, is damaging to the research community. And I don't know how many more articles we have to read and how much more articulation of that core deficit in our research policy we have to listen to before the government will sit up and take notice on its lack of coherence in relation to research policy. And again, research is a key strategic imperative in terms of future economic growth and competitiveness for our country. While overall levels of employment will remain high, we are extremely concerned that there is no sign of any engagement with the casualisation of employment and unfair contracts. The budget contained no provision to address this major problem. No area sums up the failure of Fine Gael to develop and implement new strategies more than health. The inheritance of the Riley-Varadkar years has been deeply destructive, including the attempt to influence a massively wasteful and failed new funding model. In the last 2 years, waiting lists have increased by 56%, 56%, and pressures within the system are mounting by the day. Yet Minister Varadkar kept denying this for the last 2 years, and so did you, Taoiseach. The scrapping of the National Treatment Purchase Fund caused enormous harm, in my opinion. Its re-establishment is a first step, but nowhere near enough. And the most important thing, Taoiseach, about the NTPF is the spirit it works in, where it helps use the full capacity of the national system to provide the badly needed operations and surgeries for people. And it's not just about providing money. There was a whole system of analysing in a forensic way the waiting list and waiting times and creating a competitive approach to getting the surgeries completed. And it did work. And it did reduce operations waiting times down to 6 months for adults and 3 months for children, in some cases even exceeding that. I can never understand why Minister Riley just got rid of it and rendered it impotent in terms of these issues. As has been exposed, Taoiseach, by a number of journalists, the presentation of health budgets in recent years has been borderline fraudulent due to the behaviour of government. Service plans have been published without the relevant funding. The mental health budget has been deliberately overstated and manipulated at budget time. This was only exposed through freedom of information and has yet even to be acknowledged by government. Before we can judge this budget, we have to see the relevant service plans and check if the manipulations of the past have been repeated. We have been pushing for urgent action on childcare for a number of years and welcome in principle the extension of a universal scheme. However, the lack of operational details or a strategy to ensure adequate supply means we have to wait and see before going any further. We are concerned at the steep cut-off in income limits, which offers a significant trap for middle-income earners. While this appears to have been enough to satisfy some government backbenchers, it has not addressed the core problem facing the squeezed. In fact, it may, in certain circumstances, increase affordability problems for them. We will be seeking an early committee review of the proposal and call on the Minister to immediately publish all background work carried out in deciding the levels and thresholds to be implemented. The housing emergency developed in recent years because of a lack of delivery, not because of a lack of funding. No matter what targets were set, they were always missed. Even though Fine Gael and Labour put their most aggressive ministers into the department, they presided over an emergency which now includes every type of housing, from rental to ownership. While the then Minister Alan Kelly was busy propagandising and doing all sorts of interviews, he ensured that in 2015 the number of local authority new builds was the lowest ever recorded. The lowest ever recorded in 2015. We believe that the package announced yesterday risks further unbalancing of the sector. Local authorities have not been given the staff or expertise required to deliver the 1,750 homes provided for. Some initiatives will simply drive prices higher, and the plight of thousands faced with extortionate variable rate mortgage interest rates is ignored. The 35% cut in capital support for the Irish language and the Gaeltacht is a sad reflection on a government which seems intent on wasting the historic opportunity of the rising interest in our native language. Tá dimán down oring Taoiseach, nach bhfuil go leor airge down chun stratéis na Gaeilge a chuir chun cín im líne, agus tá sé riachtanach tusa agus an rialtas ahrú a dhéanamh ar an scéal sin. During the election, we successfully argued that rural Ireland has been devastated by the loss of services and lack of any concrete plans for the future. The renaming of a department to include rural in the title means nothing in the absence of a coherent strategy. Funding which amounts to no more than $500,000 per county is no statement of intent. There, of course, also remains no sign of any credible transport or infrastructure strategy. It returns me to Minister Ross. The core issue with this government is its drift. It appears mainly concerned with internal manoeuvrings within Fine Gael and seemingly no interest in trying to set a strategic direction for our economy and our public services. And we certainly picked that up during the last week or so. There's clearly something internally going on which is kind of making it difficult for people externally watching in terms of to decode, in terms of the policy positions and so on like that. But the only thing I think stopping ministers is their own commitment. They do need a majority in this House to tell us, they don't, sorry, need a majority in this House to tell us what they want to do and where they see the future of the areas that they oversee. The regressive damage of Fine Gael has been stopped by this budget, but many opportunities are being missed and threats unaddressed. This budget is a partial departure from the damage of the last 5 years. It must be the last we see which is so devoid of urgency or strategic ambition. Thank you very much, Micheál.